The invasion of Poland in September 1939 ignited World War II, and seemingly boundless, majestic expanse of the Atlantic Ocean was instantly transformed into the most formidable, treacherous, and without exaggeration, the deadliest theater of war. This was no mere naval skirmish or a traditional battle of the Atlantic. It was the profound tragedy of the Atlantic, an intense, relentless confrontation that became not just a metaphor, but the very heartbeat of the entire war. Its outcome, every success or failure in this merciless aquatic struggle, directly dictated nothing less than the physical survival of Great Britain, and with it, the fragile hopes of the entire free world to resist the escalating tyranny of Nazi Germany. The threat was existential, palpable, hanging over every home, every family across the British Isles, every ton of food delivered to the hungry shores of the United Kingdom, every barrel of oil fueling factories, the war industry, and the Royal Air Force, every crate of ammunition flowing from the safe harbors of North America was not just cargo. They represented a vital, thin, yet resilient lifeline, connecting the besieged island to its allies, ensuring its breath, its very existence, and its capacity to continue the fight. Without these convoys, ceaselessly crossing the ocean, Britain would have been doomed to capitulation, and the outcome of the war could have been drastically different. It was this lifeline, this critical artery, that Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of submarines, the Felshaber der U-Boote, BDU, of the Third Reich, sought to ruthlessly and definitively sever. In his eyes, the Atlantic was not an ocean, but a battlefield he was determined to transform into a graveyard for Allied convoys, thereby breaking Britain's will to resist and paving the way for the ultimate victory of the Axis. At the heart of this ruthless struggle for the Atlantic stood the figure of Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, not merely a military commander, but a true strategist and virtuoso of naval warfare, whose foresight and ruthlessness in the deployment of submarines revolutionized perceptions of battle at sea. Donitz didn't just command, he lived and breathed the idea of submarine warfare, developing, refining, and personally instilling in his crews a philosophy of relentless, coordinated hunting. It was he who developed the infamous and devastating Wolfpack, Rudeltaktik tactics, which became the embodiment of his genius and a nightmare for Allied sailors. The mechanism of this tactic was simple in its core, yet devilishly effective. Lone U-boats, acting as inconspicuous scouts, patrolled the vast, boundless expanses of the ocean. Upon locating a convoy, such a scout would not attack immediately, unless the situation was exceptionally favorable, but would swiftly radio its coordinates, course, and speed back to Donitz's headquarters. Receiving this data, the Grand Admiral personally directed dozens of other nearby U-boats to the target. These wolves would begin to converge on the convoy, forming a broad cordon that surrounded their potential prey. The climax arrived with sunset. It was under the cover of utter darkness, when human vision became useless, that the night surface attacks would commence. This was a key element of Donitz's tactics. Submarines would surface, where their powerful diesel engines, unlike the slower electric motors underwater, allowed them to achieve high speeds, up to 17 to 18 knots. Such speed gave them a colossal advantage, enabling them to easily outpace slow, heavily laden convoys, and often even outrun the less maneuverable escort ships. The low silhouette of a U-boat, especially the Type 7, was phenomenally stealthy on the choppy ocean surface, blending with the waves and the darkness. Submariners, possessing excellent night vision, would advance using binoculars rather than periscopes, which were slow and revealed their presence. They would silently, or almost silently, if the sea state was favorable, slip through the escort screen, penetrating directly into the heart of the formation, where merchant ships moved like helpless sheep in a flock. Then followed swift, ruthless torpedo strikes, often from minimal distances, ensuring maximum probability of hits and catastrophic consequences. It was a deadly ballet, orchestrated by Donitz's genius, in which his U-boats were the invisible performers of death. The scale of losses in this ruthless battle of the Atlantic was truly catastrophic, shocking even seasoned admirals and politicians. Thousands of merchant ships, vital for supplying Great Britain, were sent to the bottom of the sea. Hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo, ranging from food and raw materials to ammunition and fuel, vanished into the icy waters. The year 1942 proved particularly devastating, going down in history as the second happy time for German U-boat crews. In that year, U-boats sank over 100 ships monthly, with the total tonnage in some months reaching an astounding 600 to 700,000 tons. This was not merely a localized advantage, but a veritable naval blitzkrieg threatening the very existence of Allied shipping. Such monstrous losses transformed the Battle of the Atlantic into a true war of attrition. It represented an existential threat of strangulation for Great Britain. A nation that depended on sea lanes for 80% of its vital supplies faced famine, a shortage of raw materials for industry, and a critical deficit of fuel, which could paralyze its army, navy, and air force. The introduction of food and fuel rationing became a harsh reality for every Briton, but even these measures could not fully compensate for the rapid disappearance of ships. Churchill's government realized that if this trend continued, Britain would be forced to capitulate, regardless of successes on other fronts. Behind every sunken ton, behind every vanished ship, lay an incalculable human cost. Tens of thousands of sailors, both civilian and military, found their graves in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Many perished from explosions and fires, others from hypothermia in lifeboats, and still others from starvation or thirst if they weren't rescued in time. The cries of the drowning, the smell of burning fuel oil, the sight of debris and bodies floating in the oily water. These images became a horrifying daily reality for the few survivors. These were not mere statistics. These were the lives of individuals who risked everything every day to maintain the vital flow of supplies, and very often paid with their lives. The Atlantic had become a fathomless mass grave. Against the backdrop of these catastrophic losses, the most horrifying and demoralizing aspect was that the Allies found themselves in a state of almost complete, paralyzing despair. They seemingly had no effective answer to Donitz's deadly wolf packs. The existing detection technologies of the time were primitive and often tragically ineffective. Early shipboard radars, such as the British Type 286 or the American SC, had extremely limited range, especially under difficult sea conditions or in unfavorable weather. Their capabilities for detecting the low, elusive silhouettes of U-boats on the surface were extremely poor, particularly under the cover of night, the very element in which German submariners felt most confident. Radar screens were cluttered with wave interference, and only at dangerously close ranges could one hope for a contact, which was often too late for an effective attack. Underwater, the situation was no better. The hydroacoustic devices, known as ASDIC, Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, by the British, or early versions of sonar by the Americans, were essentially a blind eye in the aquatic element. Their narrow directional sound beam could see only in a limited sector, and their range rarely exceeded a few hundred meters. The slightest movement of an enemy submarine, extraneous noise, such as a depth charge explosion or the sounds of a passing convoy, or most frequently, the presence of a thermocline, layers of water with different temperatures and densities, could easily distort, weaken, or completely block its signal, turning a ping into an indistinct hum or even silence. Contacts were unreliable, often lost. ASDIC was effective only for detecting close-range targets and completely inadequate for searching for lurking predators at depth or in distant sectors. Escort ships were forced to move very slowly to obtain any reliable contact, which made them vulnerable and ineffective against fast U-boats. This technological helplessness bred a deeply ingrained perception of an invisible and invulnerable enemy. On board the escort ships, despair and a growing fear prevailed. How could one fight an adversary that appeared from nowhere, delivered a deadly blow, and vanished without a trace, dissolving into the boundless, dark depths where no ear or eye of the Allied hunters could reach it? Donitz's submariners were ghosts, phantoms striking from an otherworldly realm. The ocean, instead of being an ally, seemed their accomplice, concealing and protecting the killers. This was a matter of life and death, a question of civilization's survival, and the answer seemed unattainable, hidden somewhere at the bottom of the silent, yet deadly ocean. This despair reached its peak by early 1943, when it seemed the Atlantic would forever remain the domain of the wolf packs. During the initial, most triumphant years of the war, as Grand Admiral Karl Donitz's ominous wolf packs sowed panic and death across the vast expanses of the Atlantic, every German submariner, from the young engine room rating to the seasoned ace commander, lived with an unwavering, almost mystical illusion of invulnerability. This was no mere professional conviction or bravado born of youthful exuberance and naval romance. It was a deeply ingrained psychological state, forged by a series of stunning successes, minimal self-losses in the early stages of the conflict, and, most importantly, an unshakable belief in the undeniable technological superiority of their U-boats. In their minds, beneath the waves of the turbulent ocean, there were no equals on this deadly arena. They were the arbiters of fate, not the victims. Their pride in their boats was not merely immense, it bordered on reverence and a sense of being chosen. Whether it was the versatile, agile, standard Type 7s, which became the backbone of the submarine fleet and earned the crew's nickname Atlantic Donkeys for their resilience and reliability, or the larger, ocean-going Type 9s, capable of operating off the distant shores of America and even in the far-off Indian Ocean. Each was considered the pinnacle of submarine construction of its era. These steel sharks carried not only torpedoes but also the hopes of the Reich. They were capable of diving deeper, moving faster underwater than any Allied destroyer, and, crucially, disappearing without a trace, dissolving into the water column, perceived as perfect instruments of war, ultimate predators. The crews, having undergone brutal selection processes, grueling training that pushed them to the limits of physical and psychological endurance, and having survived the first deadly patrols, felt themselves not just sailors but true masters of the depths, the elite of the Kriegsmarine, iron men in iron coffins. They were invisible predators, capable of delivering lethal blows with minimal risk to themselves, or so they believed. Their daring and skill became legends, both in Germany and among their adversaries. In their perception, they were elusive ghosts, hunting in a realm inaccessible to the enemy, emerging from the abyss to strike and then vanishing instantly. Every sortie was not just a routine mission, it was a personal affirmation of their dominance, their unseen power over the ocean, and, more importantly, over death itself. This was the peak of the German U-boat fleet's might, a time when it seemed no force, no technology could stop them, and every Allied convoy was merely a matter of time and suitable tactics for their annihilation. This self-assurance, bolstered by real successes, was their shield, their armor, but soon it would become their Achilles heel. If the depths were their sanctuary, then night was their most loyal and lethal ally. It was under the cloak of utter darkness, when human vision became useless and the ocean merged with the low, leaden sky, that the main part of their tactics, the art of night hunting, unfolded. For Donitz's submariners, darkness was not an obstacle, but a field of opportunity where their superiority was fully unleashed. The use of darkness as the primary advantage was the cornerstone of the Wolfpack tactics. In these years, escort ships' radars were primitive and ineffective against low-lying targets amidst sea swell, and the absence of nighttime aviation in the central Atlantic meant that U-boats could operate on the surface almost with impunity. Night concealed them from view, casting their low silhouette into absolute indistinguishability, allowing them to approach striking distance without being seen. This is precisely why Donitz insisted on surface attacks. U-boats would surface where their powerful diesel engines, unlike the slower and energy-intensive electric motors underwater, allowed them to achieve impressive speeds, up to 17 to 18 knots. Such speed gave them a colossal advantage, enabling them to easily outpace slow, heavily laden convoys, often moving at 8 to 10 knots, and even often exceed the speed of the less maneuverable escort ships. The low silhouette of a U-boat, especially the Type 7, was phenomenally stealthy on the choppy ocean surface, blending with the waves and the darkness. Submariners, possessing excellent night vision, would advance using binoculars and FUMO 29/30 radars, though primitive, rather than periscopes, which were slow, revealed their presence with splashes, and offered limited visibility. This was a direct confrontation where U-boats used speed and stealth for a sudden attack. Stealth and speed allowed them to make daring penetrations of the convoy order. U-boats would silently, or almost silently, if favorable sea conditions allowed, slip through the screen of escort ships, which futilely attempted to locate them in the darkness. Having passed through the defensive perimeter, they found themselves directly among the merchant ships, moving like helpless sheep in a flock. Then followed swift, ruthless torpedo strikes, often from minimal distances, from 500 to 1,000 meters, ensuring maximum probability of hits and catastrophic consequences. The drama of these attacks was indescribable. The ocean would suddenly be illuminated by the bright, eerie flash of a signal flare, picking out the silhouette of a doomed victim from the profound darkness. Then would follow a deafening, all-shaking explosion, which could be followed by a second, a third, a fourth. The commander on the U-boat's bridge would see burning tankers transform into floating torches, illuminating the ocean expanse, and the cries of doomed sailors drowning in fuel oil. This was their happy hour, a time of complete, almost unpunished hunting, where night was their cloak and torpedoes their deadly voice. When day broke, bringing with it the threat of aerial detection or the persistent pursuit by Allied destroyers, German submariners had their final, as they believed, and absolutely reliable sanctuary of the deep. For them, diving did not signify retreat, but a transition into a different, safer dimension. Diving to 100, 150, and sometimes even a record 200 meters, depths their robust hulls could withstand, was considered an absolute, inviolable guarantee of safety. At this moment, the U-boat literally vanished, dissolving into the water column. The commander would give the order, "To depth! Engines off!" and the boat would descend, leaving behind only a barely perceptible wake on the surface that quickly dispersed. No Allied forces, in their conviction, could reach them or even find them at such depths. This was their main defensive weapon, not steel and torpedoes, but the very element of the sea itself. Their conviction was not based on empty speculation, but on solid physical principles of hydroacoustics and the well-known limitations of Allied technology at the time. In water, there exist so-called acoustic shadows, areas where sound waves practically do not penetrate due to the specifics of sound propagation. Furthermore, the thermocline, layers of water with different temperatures and densities, often forming in the Atlantic at certain depths, acted as a powerful acoustic mirror. It did not just distort, but literally reflected the sound waves of early sonars back to their source, preventing them from passing further. Thus, a U-boat hiding beneath a thermocline became invisible to surface ships, located behind an impenetrable, invisible barrier. This was akin to the submarine being behind a concrete wall for sound. Adding to this was the pervasive acoustic fog of the ocean itself. The noise of crashing waves against the hull, the whisper of currents, and most significantly, the roar of escort ships' propellers, which filled all acoustic space, created a dense background. In this chaos, a U-boat, with its engines off and holding its breath, became truly invisible to any device, save perhaps its own listening crew. In the depths, in complete silence, where only the faint creak of the steel hull under immense water pressure could be heard. They felt absolutely secure. Down there they were confident they had evaded all detection, that their iron coffin had transformed into a safe haven, inaccessible to Allied retribution. The unwavering confidence of German submariners in their underwater invulnerability was not unfounded. It was fueled by their well-understood limitations of early Allied sonar, which was then the primary means of submarine detection. This device, despite its overall importance, was more of a blind eye in the vast aquatic element than an all-seeing one. A major problem with early hydrophones, such as the British ASDIC, Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, or the first versions of American sonar, was their narrow, directional sound beam and extremely short range. They could see only in a limited sector, and then at a distance rarely exceeding a few hundred meters, often just 400 to 800 yards, about 360 to 730 meters. The operator had to slowly rotate the transducer, literally feeling the water. Even if contact with a U-boat was established, it was incredibly easy to lose with the slightest maneuver of the submarine or change in the hunter ship's course. It was like trying to catch a fly in a dark room with a very narrow flashlight beam. Furthermore, the effectiveness of these early sonars critically depended on numerous environmental conditions that constantly changed in the Atlantic. The aforementioned thermocline, layers of water with different temperatures, and consequently, densities and sound propagation speeds, was a true curse for ASDIC operators. It acted as an impenetrable wall, completely reflecting or greatly weakening sound pulses. The sea was also filled with noise, the roar of waves, the noise of the hunter ship's own propellers, the sounds of other convoy ships, and bio-noise from marine life. All this created a cacophony in which the faint echo signal from a U-boat was extremely difficult to isolate. As a result, contacts were extremely unreliable, often false or too brief for accurate targeting. And finally, these early sonars were extremely ineffective against deep targets. A U-boat, diving beneath a thermocline or to a significant depth, could practically guarantee its safety. The sound waves simply did not reach it, or returned too weak and distorted to be recognized. Allied destroyers might desperately circle above the presumed dive site, dropping dozens of depth charges on luck, but most often their efforts were futile. The U-boat was located where the sonar's eye could not see it, in safety behind an invisible but impenetrable acoustic barrier. This blindness of Allied technology was one of the main reasons for the catastrophic success of the German wolf packs. The shortcomings of early Allied technologies were not just theoretical weaknesses. They were loopholes that German submariners exploited with astonishing skill, turning every engagement into a sophisticated cat-and-mouse game. This was where the genius and coolness of U-boat commanders were fully displayed. These aces of the Atlantic, names like Otto Kretschmer, king of the silent service, the most successful U-boat commander, Gunther Prien, the bull of Scapa Flow, famous for audaciously sinking the battleship Royal Oak, Erich Topp, Joachim Schepke, and many others, were not merely brave captains. They were masters of tactical cunning, profoundly understanding not only the capabilities of their own boat, but also the weaknesses of the enemy. They meticulously knew every blind spot of ASDIC, every peculiarity of sound propagation in the ocean. Their decisions were swift, intuitive, and often brilliant. After an attack or when pursuit was detected, their evasion methods were honed to perfection. Sharp maneuvers. U-boats would execute instantaneous changes in course and depth, allowing them to slip out of ASDIC's narrow beam. Diving below the thermocline. If depth and acoustic conditions permitted, the boat would swiftly dive beneath the thermocline. There, behind an impenetrable sound barrier, it became virtually invisible to surface ships. Deploying decoys. Bold. German submariners used special chemical decoys known as bold, from Bolzen, bolt, pin, or bubble obvious lure, decoy, which, reacting with water, released gas bubbles. These bubbles created a false echo on ASDIC, simulating the presence of a U-boat and distracting pursuers. Shutting down engines and drifting. In desperate situations, commanders would order all machinery to be completely shut down, and the boat would drift in complete silence, relying on the ocean's acoustic fog and hoping the destroyer would pass by. This required immense composure, but often worked. Such constant outmaneuvering of the enemy had a powerful psychological effect. The German submariners' confidence in their invincibility grew with each successful escape. They felt not just equal, but significantly superior to the enemy, capable of an intellectual and technical duel. It was the sensation of outplaying clumsy pursuers who, like blind giants, circled helplessly above them, dropping bombs in vain, while the wolf had long since departed to find a new victim. This self-assurance, bolstered by real successes, was their shield, their armor, but soon it would become their Achilles' heel, as the invisible enemy would learn to see them in the darkest depths. While the German wolf packs celebrated their victories and their commanders reveled in the illusion of invulnerability, on the other side of the Atlantic, in grim offices and secret laboratories of the Allies, a sense of hopelessness was growing. However, it was precisely this despair that became the catalyst for an unprecedented technological breakthrough. By late 1942 to early 1943, the situation for Great Britain had become critical, if not catastrophic. C 2.1.1, Supply Crisis. The growing threat of a complete severance of vital sea lanes was more acute than ever. The tonnage of sunken ships exceeded the rate of their construction, and reserves of food, raw materials, and crucially, oil in the British Isles were steadily dwindling. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, would later write in his memoirs that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. He, along with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, exchanged anxious messages that sounded like desperate cries for help. At the highest levels of command, it was clear, if the Allies did not find a way to counter the submarine threat, Great Britain would be strangled, and the entire course of the war would be jeopardized. This was not just a military campaign, but a true race for survival. The Allies understood that without a radical breakthrough in anti-submarine warfare, the war, despite successes on other fronts, would be lost. It was evident that existing methods and technologies were not working, and entirely new solutions, capable of detecting and destroying the invisible enemy in its underwater sanctuary, were urgently needed. The fate of the world hung in the balance. Under these conditions, a colossal, unprecedented effort was launched in an atmosphere of the deepest secrecy and tension. The brightest minds of Britain and America, physicists, engineers, mathematicians, acousticians, were gathered in closed laboratories and research centers. Their task was not merely to improve existing technologies, but to make a leap that would change the rules of the game. Every day spent without a solution meant new losses, new lives given to the icy waves of the Atlantic. The pressure was immense, but so was the determination. It was this despair that became fertile ground for the birth of a revolution in hydroacoustics. Against the backdrop of the escalating crisis caused by the U-boat's rampage, an unprecedented project was launched in Britain and the United States, bringing together the brightest minds of their time. These were true think tanks of the war. In the United Kingdom, the primary research hub for anti-submarine warfare became the Admiralty Anti-Submarine Warfare Establishment, ASE, located in Portsmouth and Fairley. Here, leading physicists, mathematicians, and engineers worked, often detached from academic careers and immersed in military necessities. In the United States, giants like Bell Labs, already renowned in communications, played a similar role, as did divisions of the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, such as the Columbia University Division of War Research. These institutions combined efforts, exchanging ideas and results, which significantly accelerated the process. Their mission was monumental and seemingly impossible. To completely rethink hydroacoustics, they needed to find fundamentally new solutions to eliminate all the blind spots of existing sonars, those fatal flaws so skillfully exploited by German submariners. Scientists had to develop systems that could increase detection range from hundreds of meters to many kilometers, see through the thermocline, which served as an impenetrable shield for U-boats, filter out sea noise to isolate the barely discernible echo from a submarine. This was a race not just for improvement, but for the creation of something entirely new, capable of shifting the balance of power across the ocean. A unique atmosphere of intellectual storm and intense work at the limits of possibility reigned in these laboratories. Scientists often worked under the strictest secrecy, unaware of the full context of their research, but understanding its vital importance. Many ideas that might have seemed mad in peacetime were now taken seriously. Thousands of experiments were conducted, dozens of prototypes were created, and tested under conditions as close to combat as possible. Endless hours of calculations, design, testing, and redesign, all driven by the realization that every minute of delay meant new casualties and brought Great Britain closer to defeat. It was a titanic effort by geniuses working in the shadows, but the results of their endeavors were destined to thunder across the Atlantic. Scientists in secret laboratories faced fundamental problems in hydroacoustics, but it was their deep understanding of the physics of sound in water that led to a true revolution in acoustics. They realized that simply amplifying the old ASDIC wouldn't work. A completely new approach was required. One of the first and most crucial discoveries was the understanding that to effectively detect submarines at long distances and through the thermocline, lower sound frequencies needed to be used. The high-frequency pings of the old ASDIC were quickly absorbed by water and scattered, especially in a heterogeneous environment. Low frequencies, much like bass notes, travel much farther and are less susceptible to absorption. In conjunction with this, more powerful pulses were required, literally an acoustic punch into the water, so that even a very weak echo signal could return from great depths or distances. These two parameters, low frequency and high power, became the foundation for creating long-range sonar, capable of penetrating where old systems were powerless. However, simply powerful low-frequency pulses would be useless if they couldn't be distinguished from background noise. Therefore, engineers focused on modulation and pulse shape. They developed complex, unique acoustic signatures, pulses that had a specific structure or modulation, e.g., frequency modulation or coding. This allowed them to penetrate the thermocline, as the unique character of the pulse helped differentiate it from reflections and noise. The receiver on the escort ship could now recognize its own transmitted signal, even if it was greatly attenuated or distorted. This became the key to reducing the influence of natural ocean noise and artificial interference that had so hampered the old ASDIC. To put these principles into practice, completely new physical components were needed. It was necessary to create more effective acoustic transducers, emitters, and receivers. Instead of the simple magnetostrictive rods used previously, scientists began to develop more powerful and directional piezoelectric crystals, or new designs of magnetostrictive transducers. These new transducers were capable of generating those very low-frequency, powerful, modulated pulses and, equally importantly, effectively capturing their faint echo signals, converting them into electrical pulses for analysis. This was the culmination of highly complex physical and engineering challenges that solved the problem of sonar blindness and opened the eyes of anti-submarine hunters. If the creation of powerful, low-frequency pulses was the first part of the equation, the second, equally important, lay in the ability not only to send a signal, but also to hear its return, interpret it, and utilize it. This required a genuine revolution in signal reception and processing. The first step was the development of incredibly sensitive hydrophones, a kind of ears from the future. Unlike the crude sensors of the previous generation, these new devices were designed to pick up extremely weak echo signals that might return after traveling through kilometers of water, thermoclines, and numerous noise interferences. They were akin to microphones capable of hearing a whisper in a stadium. These hydrophones, often housed in streamlined domes beneath the ship's hull, minimized their own noise and allowed for maximum effective reception of the reflected sound. Without such sensitivity, all efforts to create a powerful emitter would have been in vain. The weak electrical signal received from the hydrophone then entered complex analog processors. These were not digital computers in the modern sense, but ingenious vacuum tube circuits designed to perform several critically important functions. Noise filtering. Special filters cut out the constant background noise of the ocean, the roar of propellers, the engine noise of the ship itself, and other interferences, isolating the barely discernible but specific echo signal from this chaos. Echo signal amplification. Even after filtering, the echo signal was very weak, so it was repeatedly amplified, making it strong enough for analysis. Visualization on displays. This was one of the most significant innovations. Instead of relying solely on the operator's hearing, as was the case with ASDIC, the echo signal could now be visualized. Early models used raster displays, where the target's position could be shown as a bright dot or line. Later, oscilloscope displays appeared, which provided a more detailed representation of the pulse shape and distance to the target. The operator now not only heard the ping, but also saw it. All these enhancements led to the creation of entirely new, significantly more informative operator consoles. Now, the sonar operator had at their disposal not only headphones, but also a full-fledged display. This gave them the ability not just to hear a vague ping, but to see the target's course, speed, and even approximate depth much more accurately. By correlating data on echo delay time, frequency change, Doppler effect, signal intensity, and its visual representation, an experienced operator could build a much more precise picture of the U-boat's location and movement. This was a giant leap forward, transforming blind listening into almost sighted tracking, allowing anti-submarine hunters to finally gain a true understanding of their invisible adversary. All these efforts, the creation of powerful low-frequency pulses, highly sensitive hydrophones, and complex processors, led to one main, truly revolutionary result: an incredible increase in detection range. This was the pivotal change that transformed a blind eye into a seeing eye. Where the old ASDIC struggled to feel a few hundred meters, the new sonar, systems like the British Type 144Q/147B or the American QHB, could now see at distances of 3 to 5 kilometers and even more. This was truly seeing beyond the horizon compared to previous capabilities. Targets that would have previously been completely invisible now appeared on screens long before they could pose an immediate threat. This breakthrough meant that escort ships were no longer limited by an ineffective short range, but could illuminate vast areas of the ocean. This increase in range gave the Allies an enormous, unprecedented tactical superiority. They now had the ability to detect U-boats long before they could approach for a torpedo attack. A destroyer could pinpoint a submarine when it was still several kilometers from the convoy, deploy its forces, and warn other ships and aircraft. The initiative completely shifted to the hunters. Instead of passively awaiting an attack and trying to locate the enemy only after a torpedo strike, escort ships could now actively pursue, corner, and destroy U-boats. This changed the entire dynamic of the battle. The moments of the first successful trials of these new systems were filled with drama and a profound realization of their significance. Under conditions of the strictest secrecy, at test ranges far from prying eyes, teams of engineers and sailors watched as, for the first time, Clear and stable target indications appeared on their screens at unprecedented distances, through the very thermoclines that had once been an insurmountable barrier. Scientists who had worked on theoretical problems for decades now saw their labor translated into a reality capable of saving millions of lives. These early successes were confirmation of the incredible capabilities of the new sonar. They were a harbinger of the coming storm for German submariners, a whisper in the deep that would soon turn into a resounding verdict on their invulnerability. Early 1943 marked the end of the golden age of submarine warfare for the Kriegsmarine and the dawn of a new era for the Allies. The first months of 1943 brought unprecedented, inexplicable losses to German submariners. But even before Black May struck them with full force, a revolution in Allied tactics was already unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic, foreshadowing the coming catastrophe for the wolf packs. The new, long-range sonar became the cornerstone of an entirely new, aggressive strategy. With the advent of improved sonar, escort ships ceased to be passive defenders. Now, equipped with this powerful eye, they became the active initiators of attack. Instead of frantically searching for an enemy that had already struck, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes could detect a U-boat long before it approached the convoy. The ping of the new sonar was no longer a timid call. It was a challenge, a call to battle. The commander of an anti-submarine vessel, having established stable contact at a kilometer's distance, could confidently turn his ship and head directly for the target, preparing depth charges and other anti-submarine weaponry in advance. This was a completely different, deadly dance of the hunters, where the initiative was entirely on their side. The sonar breakthrough allowed not only individual ships, but also entire groups of ships and even aircraft to work in incomparably more effective coordination. Ships could transmit precise U-boat location data via radio to other vessels, creating true hunting zones. Aircraft equipped with radars, more on this below, could be vectored to a sonar-detected target, or vice versa. These were no longer disparate efforts, but a finely tuned, deadly mechanism where each element reinforced the actions of the other. A U-boat that could previously easily evade a single pursuer now found itself under fire from multiple ships and aircraft, with no chance of escape. A crucial addition to the underwater revolution was the implementation of radars on long-range aircraft. Air patrols like the American B-24 Liberator and the British Short Sunderland received new centimeter-band radars, e.g., ASV Mark III. These radars could detect U-boats running on the surface at night from distances of up to 30 to 50 kilometers, which was previously unthinkable. In addition, the tactic of bombing with illumination, lee light, was developed. A powerful searchlight mounted on an aircraft that was switched on at the last moment after radar detection. This allowed the aircraft to home in precisely on a U-boat running on the surface in complete darkness and drop depth charges before it could dive. The aerial dead zone in the mid-Atlantic, where U-boats felt relatively safe, was eliminated. German submariners, who were once invisible in the ocean, could no longer hide even under the cover of night. Sonar and radar, working in tandem, closed all avenues of retreat. All these changes in Allied tactics and technologies reached their zenith in one of the bloodiest and most decisive months of World War II. May 1943 went down in history as Black May for the German U-boat fleet and became the absolute peak of catastrophe for the U-boats. It was an irreversible, bloody turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic that forever changed the course of the war at sea. Before this month, German submariners had dominated, inflicting damage that threatened the survival of Great Britain. But in May, everything changed. The figures were simply shocking and still evoke a cold dread among historians. In May 1943 alone, over 40 German U-boats were sunk, a colossal loss, representing almost a quarter of the entire active Kriegsmarine fleet. This was a level of attrition that was utterly unacceptable and irreplaceable for Donitz and his command. At the same time, Allied convoy losses sharply, almost catastrophically decreased. While earlier in the year, tens and hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping were lost monthly, now, despite the active operations of the wolf packs, convoys reached their destinations practically without losses, and in some cases, without even a single damage. The balance of power was shattered. For the German submariners, this was a catastrophe that no one expected. Commanders who, just months before, felt like invulnerable masters of the deep, now returned from patrols with terrifying stories. Of torpedoes fired at destroyers that suddenly turned and rammed them. Of aircraft appearing out of nowhere in the middle of the night to drop bombs. Of sonar that saw them through the thermocline as if it wasn't even there. The belief in invisibility was shattered, and confidence in the sanctuary of the deep proved to be a fatal delusion. Every sortie was now not a hunt, but a deadly roulette, with the odds clearly not in their favor. Morale plummeted. The ocean, which had been their home and their ally, now turned into a merciless enemy, inhabited by unseen, all-seeing hunters. The myth of U-boat invincibility was dispelled by the bloody wind of Black May. The consequences of Black May were not only tactical and strategic, they dealt a devastating blow to the very psychology of German submariners, shattering their fundamental belief in themselves and their boats. On board the returning U-boats, bewilderment verging on panic reigned. The constantly repeated question echoing through the cramped compartments was, how did they find us? Boats that dived to 100 to 200 meters considered themselves absolutely safe. The thermocline, previously an impregnable fortress, now seemed to no longer exist. Allied destroyers, instead of helplessly circling on luck, began to deliver precise, lethal blows, tracking the U-boat wherever it went. Submariners, accustomed to long cat-and-mouse games, now found that their game was over, and they were no longer the cats. Testimonies from surviving sailors were filled with horror and incomprehension. "They saw us through the water," some exclaimed. Others spoke of devilish acoustics that left them no chance, or of invisible radars that plucked them from the utter darkness without the slightest warning. Some commanders described how destroyers pursued them for hours, maintaining stable contact, dropping depth charges with terrifying accuracy, giving no chance of escape. Their evasion methods, sharp maneuvers, dropping bolts, shutting down engines, no longer worked. It was as if the ocean itself had betrayed them, revealing their vulnerabilities to the enemy. In the face of such a shocking, inexplicable defeat, conspiracy theories and superstitions began to emerge. U-boat crews lacking access to information about the Allied technological breakthrough tried to find explanations. Rumors spread about telepathy used by the British and Americans, about spies in ports who reported the departure of every boat, or about a new secret weapon. But no one could say exactly what that weapon was. Paradoxically, they could not even imagine that it was about improved sonar, so radical and effective had it proven compared to what they were accustomed to. This lack of knowledge only fueled their fear and demoralization. The result was a broken spirit throughout the entire U-boat fleet. Despair replaced former confidence. A sense of helplessness before an all-seeing and all-hearing enemy became dominant. The feeling of betrayal by the ocean, which had once been their loyal ally and sanctuary, now pierced everyone. Sailors who once proudly put to sea now felt profound fear. Every patrol became an almost suicidal undertaking. The U-boat, which had recently been a symbol of German military might and technological superiority, transformed into a deadly trap. Black May was not just a month of heavy losses. It was the month when the unshakable belief in invulnerability was destroyed and the spirit of the Kriegsmarine elite was broken. The catastrophe of Black May shook not only the ordinary submariners, but also the very creator of the Wolfpack tactics, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz himself. His genius, His unshakable faith in the submarine fleet now confronted an inexplicable and deadly reality. Initially, Donitz experienced initial shock and profound incomprehension regarding the reasons for such high losses. For him, a man who knew his strategy and his boats down to the smallest detail, it was difficult to believe the commander's reports. How could they be sunk when they dived to 150 meters? He likely pondered. He dismissed ideas of any Allied breakthrough, believing these were merely temporary setbacks or the result of tactical errors. After all, U-boats were invincible, and their technology, perfect. His staff attempted to analyze the reports, but no logical picture emerged. It was as if the laws of physics had suddenly ceased to apply. In this confusion, Donitz made fatal decisions. Not understanding the true causes, he continued to insist on aggressive actions, ordering U-boats to ignore phantom sonar contacts, which, in the Germans' view, must have been false or the result of operator errors. He urged commanders to show greater sacrifice and bravery, believing that the Allies had simply changed their tactics, not their technology. Commanders who reported the unaccounted disappearance of other boats or being pursued by invisible forces risked being accused of cowardice or incompetence. These orders only increased the number of casualties. However, unprecedented losses continued, and by the end of May, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. Eventually, Donitz was forced to make the toughest, most bitter decision of his career. On May 24, 1943, he gave the order to temporarily withdraw the majority of U-boats from the North Atlantic. This was not merely a tactical retreat. It was an open, public admission of defeat in the most critical phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic," he sorrowfully recorded in his diary, although in public statements he continued to assert it was merely a temporary regrouping. The month of Black May definitively broke the back of the German submarine fleet, and although the war at sea continued, Germany's dominance in the Atlantic was forever over. The defeat in Black May, 1943, was not merely a tactical loss, but a profound psychological blow that forever altered the nature of the war in the Atlantic and the fate of German submariners. Overnight, the world of German submariners was turned upside down. The sense of superiority and invulnerability gave way to a terrifying reality. The hunters themselves became the hunted. U-boats that once moved freely both on the surface and at depth now faced constant threat. The realization that depth no longer provided protection, that the thermocline was no longer a reliable sanctuary, was the most frightening discovery. The U-boat, which had so recently been an invisible predator, now transformed into a vulnerable, easily detectable target. Every loading of depth charges onto an Allied destroyer was now not just ammunition, but a death sentence. Catastrophic losses led to a previously unthinkable phenomenon: broken morale. Young, energetic sailors, once eager to join the U-boat fleet, now saw their comrades vanish without a trace. For the first time, there was an increase in refusals to perform combat missions. Although these were isolated incidents and severely punished, the very fact of their occurrence was an alarming signal. The moral exhaustion of the crews reached its limit. Patrols, which were once a source of pride, now became associated with inevitable demise. Commanders tried to maintain discipline, but even the most seasoned aces felt their luck running out. Black May forever changed the perception of a submariner's mission. It came to be seen as almost suicidal. Loss statistics after 1943 are horrifying. Up to 70 to 80% of all submariners who joined the Kriegsmarine perished, making service on a U-boat one of the most dangerous in the history of warfare. Every sortie became a lottery of death. Pride was replaced by a grim realization of their purpose: to be a living shield, trying to divert attention from other fronts, with very little chance of returning. The German submariner, who only recently embodied the master of the deep, now became a victim himself. Pursued, doomed to perish in the oceanic expanses that now seemed treacherous and filled with invisible threats. Faced with the catastrophic Black May, Germany, and particularly Grand Admiral Donitz, embarked on a frantic search for a way to restore the lost parity. This was a true arms race in the deep, where each side tried to outmaneuver the other. Realizing that the technological superiority of the Allies was undeniable, German industry and scientific institutions were thrown into the development of frantic countermeasures. The goal was clear: to make U-boats invisible and lethal again. Thousands of engineers and scientists worked day and night trying to find some solution. One of the most innovative, though largely ineffective, directions was the development of acoustic coating for U-boat hulls. Under the codename Alberic, after the dwarf from Germanic mythology, guardian of treasures, or anacho, from anecho, rubber sheets several millimeters thick containing internal cavities were developed. This coating was intended to absorb sonar sound waves, preventing them from reflecting back, thereby making the boat acoustically invisible. However, the technology was complex to manufacture, unreliable in attachment, and was implemented on only a few boats, having no significant impact on the course of the war. The most radical response came in the form of completely new U-boat types: the Type 21, ocean-going, electro boats, and Type 23, small coastal projects. These boats were revolutionary. The Type 21 was designed for unprecedentedly high underwater speeds, up to 17 knots, thanks to massive batteries and a streamlined hull, allowing it to evade even the fastest destroyers. It could dive much deeper, up to 280 meters, and featured an automatic torpedo loading system. The Type 23 was a smaller, but no less innovative boat for coastal waters, also very fast underwater. These projects could have changed the course of the war, but they appeared too late and in too small numbers. Only a handful of Type 21 and Type 23 went on combat patrols at the very end of the war, when Germany was already doomed. Another important, though ambiguous, innovation was the snorkel. This retractable tube allowed U-boats to use their diesel engines underwater while the boat was at periscope depth. This significantly increased underwater endurance and speed, enabling battery charging without surfacing. However, despite its advantages, the snorkel had a fatal flaw. Its mast, though small, was visible to the new Allied centimeter radar, once again making the U-boat vulnerable. Snorkel-equipped boats were now often detected, even when they believed themselves safe. To counter the escort ships, Germany developed G7S Zaunkönig acoustic torpedoes, REN, also known as G7S T5. These torpedoes homed in on the noise of the hunter ship's propellers, following its acoustic signature. They were a formidable weapon and sank several Allied ships. However, the Allies quickly developed countermeasures, such as towed noisemakers, Foxer, which mimicked propeller noise, distracting the torpedoes. All these desperate attempts were significant technical achievements, but they could no longer change the overall picture. Germany was constantly behind, and the Allies were always one step ahead. Despite Germany's desperate attempts to respond with new technologies, the inertia and scale of production were no longer on their side. After Black May of 1943, the final Allied supremacy in the Battle of the Atlantic became undeniable. From the second half of 1943 until the end of the war, the safety of Allied convoys was virtually guaranteed. Ship losses, once measured in hundreds of thousands of tons monthly, now significantly decreased to an acceptable level. Merchant vessels, vital for supplying Great Britain and prosecuting the war in Europe, crossed the Atlantic with minimal risks. The new sonar, radars, coordinated tactics, and a significantly increased number of escort ships and aircraft created a deadly barrier that U-boats could no longer breach. The German U-boat fleet, which had recently been capable of paralyzing sea lanes and bringing Great Britain to its knees, was now forced into a constant retreat. Its ability to once again pose an existential threat to the Allies was definitively undermined. U-boats, of course, continued to conduct raids, especially in coastal waters, and even occasionally achieved success. However, their operations became sporadic and their losses unacceptable. The wolf-pack strategy was effectively broken, and the Atlantic, once a fertile hunting ground, turned into a graveyard for thousands of German submariners. The outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic is a vivid example of how science and technological superiority decided the outcome of an entire military campaign. It was not a battle of numbers, but a battle of intellect and innovation. While Germany relied on the bravery of its sailors and the initial quality of its boats, the Allies, faced with a crisis, gambled on radical scientific developments. It was the revolution in hydroacoustics, the creation of long-range sonar, improved radar, and the ability to effectively process this data that allowed them first to match and then to definitively suppress the invisible enemy. The story of the invisible predators and the whisper in the deep is a narrative of how scientific progress, born in despair, changed the rules of war and ultimately saved the world from the Nazi threat. The story of the U-boats and the revolution in hydroacoustics is not merely a narrative about ships and submariners. It is a profound lesson in technological warfare, demonstrating how scientific progress can radically change the course of history and the destinies of entire nations. The Battle of the Atlantic, which spanned the entire Second World War, was the longest and one of the most critical campaigns. Today, historians and military strategists unanimously recognize that the breakthrough in sonar and other anti-submarine technologies became one of the key factors in the Allied victory. Without the ability to effectively detect and destroy U-boats, sea communications would have been paralyzed, with catastrophic consequences for the entire Allied war effort. It was this revolution in the deep that turned the tide of the war at sea, ensuring the uninterrupted supply of Great Britain, allowing for the concentration of forces for the Normandy landings, and ultimately contributing to the defeat of the Axis. It was a triumph of the scientific approach over initial tactical superiority. The story of the German submariners is also a sad example of the price of an inability to adapt quickly in the face of changing technological warfare. U-boats, which at the beginning of the war were formidable, almost invulnerable weapons, became deadly traps for their crews when the enemy made a technological leap. The supply of Great Britain, a vital artery without which the country could not have survived and waged war, indeed could have been severed. Grand Admiral Dönitz, despite his genius, failed to timely assess the scale of Allied technological superiority and implement effective countermeasures. This led to mass casualties and a strategic defeat that proved fatal for the Third Reich. The Battle of the Atlantic offers not only lessons in technology and tactics, but also a profound philosophical conclusion about the human factor in warfare. The history of German submariners is a vivid illustration of how dogmatism and underestimation of the enemy's progress became fatal. Confidence in the invincibility of U-boats and disdain for Allied old technologies, early ASDIC, bred dangerous overconfidence. The German command, especially in the early stages of the crisis, was too consumed by its past successes and too slow to admit that the rules of the game had changed. The belief that depth will always protect transformed from a tactical principle into a dogma that cost thousands of lives. The lack of openness to the idea that the enemy could have achieved something fundamentally new prevented timely reaction. This historical episode serves as an enduring lesson for future conflicts. It underscores the critical importance of flexibility of thought, the ability to quickly rethink established paradigms and acknowledge new realities, and also the necessity of constant innovation and investment in scientific research and development, even in peacetime. Those who get stuck in old concepts, who underestimate the enemy's potential for technological leaps, are doomed to defeat. In an ever-changing world of warfare, where technology evolves exponentially, only those who are willing to constantly learn, adapt, and implement new things will be able to survive and win. The story of A Whisper in the Deep is not just a page from World War II. It is an eternal reminder that true success lies not only in the strength of weapons, but also in the power of intellect and readiness for change. The history of the Battle of the Atlantic is the culmination of a struggle of minds and technologies, where the main force became an invisible weapon that forever changed the world of submarine warfare. What began as a primitive tool, the barely audible ping of early sonar, underwent an incredible transformation in the hands of Allied geniuses. Sound, this fundamental physical wave, was turned into a lethal eye, capable of penetrating depths and thermoclines, revealing the secrets of the ocean. From faint echoes, it evolved into a clear, informative signal that not only detected the target, but also made it possible to determine its course, speed, and depth. This was not just an evolution, but an alchemical transformation that changed the very principle of naval warfare. With this transformation of sound, the ocean itself changed its role. For German submariners, it was a sanctuary, a reliable hiding place from enemy eyes. But with the advent of the new sonar, that very depth, that same mass of water that once protected them, now turned into a trap. The invisible enemy could now see them in their own home, pursue them in their sanctuary. The ocean, once an ally, became a field of death where U-boats could find no escape. This role reversal, from hunter to hunted in its own refuge, was the most brutal reality faced by Kriegsmarine submariners. Ultimately, the Battle of the Atlantic became a triumph of science, a demonstration of how engineering genius and scientific breakthrough can decide the outcome of a global conflict. In a desperate race, where the stakes were higher than ever, it was the work of scientists and engineers in secret laboratories, their ability to rethink the fundamental principles of acoustics and apply them to a military objective, that saved the world from strangulation. Without this invisible eye, which the new sonar became, Great Britain might have fallen, and the outcome of the entire Second World War could have been entirely different. This is a story of how a whisper in the deep turned into a thunderous verdict that changed the course of history.